Today, ugh, today, I'm gonna make you lose faith in humanity. Well, how can I do this? Well, there's this guy on YouTube that goes by the name of Black Pigeon Speaks, who I like to call pigeon shit, because he's got a brain which is as small as a pigeon's, and beliefs which are as repulsive as a piece of shit. Now, the interesting thing about pigeon shit is that he has amassed an impressive and simultaneously depressing number of subscribers in a very short time, for basically just spewing out bigoted, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT, far-right, fascist garbage. In many of his videos, he talks about those damn Muslims, or those damn trannies, or those damn blacks. He's basically a senile old man who binge-watches Fox News and complains about how things have changed since the good old days and how politically correct everything is. However, instead of most of those senile old men who are normally ignored, as they should be, this particular senile old man has somehow managed to get 100,000 people to listen to his bigoted rambling. Yeah, you see what I meant about losing faith in humanity? Anyway, let's get this over with. This is Pigeon Shit's video about the recent Orlando massacre.
So yet again, we have a massacre in the name of Allah and for the cause of Islam.
Islam isn't a cause, it's a religion. But carry on.
But make no mistake, the real victims of this tragedy are Muslims and multiculturalism.
Who here is really claiming that the real victims of this attack are Muslims? Most people on the left realize that the real victims of this shooting are LGBT folk. However, we aren't like you right-wing pricks in that we think putting down one group of people in order to show solidarity with another group of people is counterproductive and just straight up wrong.
The feelings of Muslims are always paramount in the aftermath of an Islamic terror attack that murders non-Muslims.
It's not that the feelings of Muslims are paramount, but there is great importance in distinguishing that the fault for such terrorist attacks does not lie upon the entire Muslim community, but rather on individual radical Muslims or radical Muslim groups. The reason why this is important is because we know that right-wing dickheads like you will not make this distinction, and will paint all Muslims with the same brush, which will pave the road for radical anti-Muslim groups like the EDL or Britain First, who basically just go around committing hate crimes against Muslims. We've seen this time and time again. It happened after 9/11, it happened after the Paris shootings, it happened after Britain voted to leave the EU, and that last one wasn't even a terrorist attack. And yet that was still an excuse for racist thugs to go around harassing and beating up Muslims and brown people.
They are apparently always potential victims in a backlash that never seems to occur.
What the fuck do you mean that this backlash never seems to occur? Do your fucking research. This shit happens almost every time radical Muslims commit terrorist attacks in non-Muslim countries.
And the very real threat to the societal cognitive dissonance of diversity as a strength comes ever more under scrutiny as this shared delusion begins to show more cracks. Once the feelings of Muslims have been tended to, we can then look on to those murdered for the crime of not being Muslims.
Muslims are more likely to be killed by Islamic terrorism than non-Muslims. Remember the whole conflict between Shiite and Sunni Islam, as well as other sects of Islam? But even if we're strictly talking about Islamic terrorism on Western soil, what about the Muslim victims of these attacks? After all, they do exist. These are certainly not done in order to purge non-Muslims only. And in the case of the Orlando attack, it would seem as though it was mainly anti-LGBT. Also, you make it seem as though we focus more on sparing the hurt feelings of Muslims than about the victims. Well, this is obviously false. I don't even know where you get that from. But I will admit that we do place some importance in making sure that the entire Muslim community is not under attack for these individual acts of terrorism. And, like I said before, we do this because dickheads like you exist.
It's a wash, rinse, repeat cycle.
Yes, I agree. It is a wash, rinse, repeat cycle. A radical Muslim commits an act of terrorism, the right wing places collective blame on the entire Muslim community while pretending to care about the victims of the attack. Hate crimes are committed against Muslims and other brown people. This is ignored, and when the next terrorist attack occurs, this cycle will repeat once more. Wash, rinse, repeat.
The President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama.
Yes, Barack Hussein Obama. Make sure to emphasize the fact that he has an Arabic-sounding middle name, you piece of shit.
is loath to use the words radical and Islam in the same sentence. It is though he believes if he does not name the enemy of the civilized world, the enemy will disappear. He has his head in the sand.
Who cares? Who the fuck cares? We all know that the problem is radical Islam. We all know that this is a case of Islamic terrorism. So why the fuck does it matter if he calls it radical jihadism or some shit? Also, I highly doubt that that's what his intention is, given that he's taken some pretty ghastly measures to supposedly combat Islamic terrorism. Drone strikes.
As does his former Secretary of State and presumptive Democratic candidate for the White House, Hillary Clinton. And here we are yet again having Muslims in the name of Allah murdering people for the crime of being non-Muslims.
Already explained this.
But this time there is a twist. Unlike in the Middle East, where homosexuals are thrown from the tops of buildings, in the United States, believers take a different tact. In the city of Orlando, Florida, at a gay nightclub called The Pulse, the adherents of the religion of peace have struck once again. The Islamic gunman, Omar Mateen, who pled allegiance to ISIS in a phone call made to 911 before the massacre, has murdered 50 and wounded 53 more in the worst act of terrorism on American soil since the Islamic terror attacks upon New York City on September the 11th, 2001. In response to this Islamic terrorism, Hillary Clinton has always been consistent. The violence that emanates from the Islamic community globally has nothing to do with Islam.
Okay, to be fair, I don't think radical Islamic terrorism doesn't have anything to do with Islam. Obviously, these terrorists have taken inspiration from a few parts of the Quran. However, these fucking pricks should not be representative of most Muslims. It's quite evident that most Muslims don't believe in that crap. After all, the Quran is a religious text, and religious texts often are things to be interpreted, such as with the Bible or the Torah.
The bombs and beheadings in the south of the Philippines and Thailand by Muslims, the car bombs and death squads in Afghanistan, the suicide bombings in countless countries throughout the world, the mass shooting deaths of people in cities like Paris, Brussels, San Bernardino, and Orlando, the massacres of people on public transportation like in Madrid and London, the grisly acts carried out by ISIS in Libya and Syria and other countries throughout the world, the execution of homosexuals across the Muslim world, etc., 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 etc. None of this violence, according to Hillary, has anything to do with Islam.
The attacks on abortion clinics in America, the murder of Protestants by Catholics, and the murder of Catholics by Protestants in Northern Ireland, the IRA terrorist attacks also in Northern Ireland, the numerous attacks of the Christian terrorist group Lord's Resistance Army, the lynchings, stabbings, shootings, and arson of the KKK, the massacre carried out by Anders Breivik, the kidnappings and murders carried out by the Army of God, the grisly murders of gay and trans people all across the Christian world, not to mention the systematic genocide of millions of Native Americans done in the name of Manifest Destiny, which was explicitly Christian, etc., 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 etc. If those acts of terrorism you listed off count as being part of Islam, then do these count as being part of Christianity? Call me a cynic, but I doubt you'd be very eager to admit that, if you did at all.
Even though Muslims and their organizations like ISIS and the Taliban expressly say that it does. Hillary is steadfast in her denial of reality. Let's be clear, however, Muslims are people. Islam is a belief system that encompasses the judicial, economic, political, individual, social, cultural, and some spiritual.
Some spiritual? Islam is a religion, not a fucking society. Like I said plenty of times earlier, there are many different types of Islam, which advocate for very different things. Again, would you talk about Christianity in the exact same way you described Islam? Your double standards are showing.
This may be why many of the Muslims now pouring into Europe are converting to Christianity, an illegal act in almost all Muslim countries on earth.
Almost all Muslim countries on earth? By that, are you talking about the 23 out of 49 Muslim countries which outlaw apostasy? Yeah, so less than half of Muslim countries means almost all. Gotcha.
Freedom of conscience is the first casualty in a Muslim society.
This depends on the country. If we're talking about Saudi Arabia, then this is definitely true. With Turkey or Algeria, however, this is less true. Keep in mind that Islam isn't a homogeneous religion. There are various different types of Islam that these governments practice. Saudi Arabia practices an ultra-conservative version of Islam called Wahhabism, while Turkey is a much more secular Muslim country, where the state doesn't necessarily have a religion to enforce, but the majority religion is still Islam. However, we should not forget that under a nation-state, no one truly has a freedom of conscience. Sure, there are varying degrees to the freedom we're allowed to have, depending on what government we're talking about. But in pretty much any society with a government and capitalist class, if you deviate too much from the status quo, don't expect the government to happily accept your difference in opinion.
Or in their colonies in the West, like London, Brussels, Birmingham, Marseille.
Oh, fuck's sake. Colonies in the West? You are such a prick. Do you even realize that none of the cities you listed off have even a majority Muslim population? Or even break past having a 30% Muslim population? Nor do any major cities in Europe. In fact, the only European countries with majority Muslim populations are Albania, Kosovo, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, none of which belong to the West.
And also, let us be clear, Muslims are not the enemy. They are the victims. They are the first that suffer under an ideology that divides the world between the house of Islam and the house of war.
Not to mention they suffer from rampant abuse brought on by fuckers like you, and some of the more extreme dickheads in your camp as well.
Islam is at war with Buddhists in Burma and Thailand.
In that particular case, the Muslims are actually the ones who are being subjugated by Buddhist extremists in Thailand and Burma. Sort of like how Muslims are being treated in the West.
Islam is at war with Hindus in India.
Again, Hindu extremist groups have been subjugating Muslims as well as Christians for years, much like in Burma and Thailand. Again, sort of like how Muslims are being treated in the West.
Islam is at war with Jews in Israel. Islam is at war with Catholics in the Philippines. Islam is at war with atheists, agnostics, and nominal Christians in Europe. Islam is at war with animists in Africa. Wherever there is Islam and the other, there is conflict.
But is it because of Muslims, or is it because extremist groups from both Islam and the majority religion of that country are constantly stoking the flames of the conflict? Remember when I said that there was a conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland? Well, there are plenty of similar religious conflicts all over the world, which don't include Islam. These conflicts are not exclusive to Islam. They are, however, exclusive to the extremists within these different religions.
As Samuel P. Huntington, in his prescient book, The Clash of Civilizations, accurately described the border regions where Islam meets the other. Islam has bloody borders.
And other countries don't? What about Israel and Palestine, Turkey and the Kurdish region, China and Tibet? These are rather bloody borders as well. Yet in these situations, Islam is of little to no importance. So once again, quit making it seem as though this is exclusive to Islam.
World leaders such as Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, David Cameron, the former substitute drama teacher Justin Trudeau,
don't really see how that's relevant, but whatever,
and Barack Hussein Obama are in no uncertain words inviting danger into their countries as they celebrate the quote-unquote vibrant diversity that millions of Islamic migrants bring to the West. And this enrichment keeps on giving in cities like Orlando. And the woman who is the Democratic nominee for the President of the United States is keen on providing even more vibrancy in terms of unvetted Islamic terrorists pouring into the United States.
First off, you literally just said that all Muslim refugees being accepted into the United States were Islamic terrorists. I don't even think that I can tell you just how fucking despicable that is. Secondly, Hillary only wants to accept, out of all the Syrian refugees that need help, only 65,000 of them into the US, which would be less than 0.021% of the population. That's hardly equivalent to the hordes of migrants that you're trying to paint this picture of.
A cursory glance at her Twitter feed is chock full of the same platitudes regularly spewed by career politicians. Something in Spanish, then something about communities standing together, some anti-gun sentiments, attempt to pander to the LGBT community, the usual need to pray and blah, 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 but not one word about radical Islam and its continued devastating effects that it is having upon Western society.
Why do you care? She's just a fucking politician. So what if she doesn't mention radical Islam in name? She's mentioned the exact same thing we're talking about now in several speeches before, including a speech she did about this very shooting. Just maybe under a different name, like jihadism or Islamist extremism, or something like that. Once again, does it really change anything if she calls the exact same threat by a different name?
If this had been a crazed white man, the charge of hate crime and the incendiary race baiting across the mainstream media would have already reached a deafening cacophony.
Don't fucking lie. You and I know full well that white terrorists in the West are, for the most part in the mainstream media, not referred to accurately as terrorists.
Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party for the 2016 presidential election, is the lone voice in world politics speaking reason to this never-ending cycle of Islamic violence.
Donald Trump speaking reason? So, you're a Trump supporter. Well, honestly, are any of you watching this really surprised by that?
In response to the Orlando massacre, he said, "Last night, our nation was attacked by a radical Islamic terrorist. It was the worst terrorist attack on our soil since 9/11 and the second of its kind in 6 months. My deepest sympathy and support goes out to the victims, the wounded, and their families." In his remarks today, President Obama disgracefully refused to even say the words radical Islam. For that reason alone, he should step down.
So the supposed voice of freedom in this whole situation claims that Obama should step down from presidency for not using the words radical Islam to describe this attack. What the fuck? I mean, sure, I can think of plenty of other reasons why you should step down. Drone strikes. But this is certainly not one of them.
If Hillary Clinton, after this attack, still cannot say the two words radical Islam, she should get out of this race for the presidency.
Both of those idiots should get out of the race. I mean, even for an anarchist, this has got to be one of the worst elections for the American voters. They basically have to choose between a deceptive imperialist or a fascist warmonger. Well, I guess that's the case with pretty much every election anyway.
If we do not get tough and smart real fast, we are not going to have a country anymore. Because our leaders are weak, I said this was going to happen, and it is only going to get worse.
Yes, what a fucking Nostradamus he is.
I am trying to save lives and prevent the next terrorist attack. We can't afford to be politically correct anymore.
Jeez, no wonder Donald Trump has gotten so many votes. He sounds exactly like every single popular right-wing dipshit here on YouTube, pretending to give a fuck about the people, but really they're only using it as an excuse to bash on immigrants and Muslims.
We admit more than 100,000 lifetime migrants from the Middle East every year. Since 9/11, hundreds of migrants and their children have been implicated in terrorism in the United States. Hillary Clinton wants to dramatically increase admissions from the Middle East, bringing in many hundreds of thousands during a first term.
Dramatically increase admissions, my ass. Sure, she'll probably accept more immigrants than Trump would if he were president, but if you think that it will be much different than the Obama administration, which, by the way, has deported over 2.5 million immigrants since he took office, more than many presidents before him, then you're sorely mistaken. Based on what she said and her advocacy for Obama's policies, if she's the next US president, she'll most probably just be Obama the sequel.
And we will have no way to screen them, pay for them, or prevent the second generation from radicalizing.
Well, maybe America would have the money to do that if you didn't piss it all away by bombing the shit out of various countries in the Middle East. Oh wait, if you didn't bomb the shit out of various countries in the Middle East, then this migrant crisis wouldn't have been such a crisis after all, now would it?
The question really begs, after yet again another devastating Islamic terrorist attack, how many bombings, shootings, and murder is enough? How many will it take for the West to fear the never-ending jihad being inflicted upon it more than the fear of being called intolerant when questioning an ideology that seeks to destroy all others in the name of their God?
Here's a question for you pigeon shit. How long will it take for you empty-headed motherfuckers and your imperialist government to realize that blowing up other countries and killing their civilians will not only make the immigration issue much worse, but it will help further radicalize civilians in such areas, and perhaps even migrants who have traveled overseas to Western countries. Think about it. If your home country was being bombed on a regular basis, you'd want to get out, wouldn't you? So you get the fuck out of this country and travel halfway around the world to a much safer land. Then you watch the news of your home country being blown the fuck up by these governments in the name of freedom and democracy. And hey, guess what? Your new country of residence is one of the countries responsible for the bombing campaign. Well, that's going to have a serious impact on you, isn't it? It's going to make you feel incredibly furious with the establishment. But because of the lack of awareness among the general public of a coherent leftist outlet for this anti-establishment attitude, such as anarchism, this anger instead manifests itself in radical Islamic fascism. And this anger might even go so far as to lead them to commit an act of domestic terrorism. And this is how most of these jihadists come to be. There is a reason for everything. It's not as easy and convenient as you and Donald Trump and Geert Wilders and all you right-wing fucks would like to let on, where nothing is the fault of the West and everything is the fault of the Middle East and Muslims. No, I'm not trying to humanize nor normalize the actions of these scumbag terrorists. But what I am saying is that for the most part, radical Islam is the monster that we created.